Hey, Rob Douglas, in case you don't know, he is our guest today. And this guy, Rob, he speaks across all three levels of what creates a cyclical ecosystem, right? Discerning church starters, and churches. Rob has been all three of those. He's been all three of those many times. And so he comes with a lot of expertise in this. He's a true practitioner of faithful innovation with frameworks that I think will really be able to help all churches, new or not new, toward creating environments for experimentation for making new disciples. So, Rob, thanks so much for joining us. Would you tell us a little more about yourself and why the heck, what's this jersey you have behind you, first of all?
Yeah. Well, I'm a huge basketball fan, and that is the jersey signed by the greatest basketball player of all time,
Oh
the great
boy.
Irvin Magic Johnson. And I'm a huge Magic fan, and this guy in my church, for a birthday present, surprised me with that authentic jersey, and I was so happy that it goes front and center there for the Zoom calls, because my wife wouldn't let me put it in the house anywhere. So it's in like my backyard office. But it's my favorite prized possession. So yeah, it's pretty cool. And thank you for asking that question, because nobody acknowledges the great Magic Johnson anymore. So it makes me happy to have a moment to talk about him. But yeah, it's really good to be with you all and see some familiar faces and some friends that I haven't seen for a while, and get to meet a few new people as well. And yeah, I know all three of those parts of that life cycle really well. I know all the things not to do in all three of those phases of the life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And the sheer terror that comes along with being in each of those phases. So yeah, I get it, but it's good to be with you guys today. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And then you've written before, but you have a most recent book. Can you tell us a little bit about this book you created called the Missional Disciple Making Handbook?
Yeah. Well, the book wasn't originally started as writing a book. It was actually a kind of a local project and thing that we were working on with our middle judicatory here, our presbytery, and trying to help get churches thinking, talking, and experimenting in the area of discipleship. So it kind of evolved into something different. It wasn't the original intention, but it was kind of exciting to see that shift take place, and then kind of work towards transitioning the material that I was working on locally for something that we thought could be helpful to others. And that was kind of the goal of the book, is we just wanted to contribute something that was helpful to churches. And we thought if we could be helpful to even just a few churches, that this would be worth doing. So, it kind of starts with our big why, and the fact that we're an organization as a church, that we actually are an organization that exists for the people that are not currently present with us. Jesus gives us that command and commission to go and make disciples, and then just talking to people, it just sensing people's frustration and kind of burnout and not knowing what to do, kind of prompted wanting to get some heads together and thinking about, well, how might we think about this a little differently. We've been exercising the gathered arm of the church so well for a long time, and that scattered arm is gotten pretty weak and atrophied, and the church is just out of balance. And so the idea with the book here is not to try to do everything, and that's really important. The book it is not a comprehensive book on discipleship. It is trying to do a few really specific things. It's trying to, one, get people together in groups or teams and actually talk about discipleship. So there's individual components to it, but really the idea is trying to bring people together to talk about this subject matter, and then to get those groups, teams, innovating and creating new experiments in their context in disciple making. So that was kind of the goal of what we were trying to do with it.
I saw you preparing. So you're a prepared guy. You like preparing. And I saw you preparing to do this book, and I know you went through a lot of literature, a lot of disciple making literature from the past 20 years. And I'm just curious of all the disciple, I mean, I'm sure you all have read a lot of disciple making books as well. But like, what kind of sets your disciple making book apart, and how does it compare and contrast with what you studied up on before you wrote this?
Yeah, I had at the beginning of this process a couple years ago, I had a major hip surgery. So I was laid up in bed for a while, Nick. Yeah, you saw me at my worst.
Mhm.
And so I had time to start reading, and I joined a couple like big discipleship networks just to try to learn as much as I could about what was going on out there. And there were just a bunch of things that surprised me. And there are positives to what's happening too. And I don't want to be too disparaging, but the negative sides of what I was seeing was just the kind of formula driven or more industrial models, very individualistic, very programmatic. And so, I mean, I would jump on like big discipleship webinars and they would just say things like, hey, just find someone and read the Bible with them. And I think that's wonderful. I don't have a problem. I think that's great.
Mhm.
We should be doing that. Or, start a small group ministry. But I don't know, when I talk to people, they're not necessarily doing that, or they've tried that and it hasn't produced the desired effect. Their churches aren't growing.
Mhm.
And that's scary. And it's just not very good contextual work. And so one of the things that we were trying to do is different, is make that shift to say that, I would hear all the time too from some people, hey, just find someone from your church and disciple them. I'm like, how about we find somebody in our neighborhood or someone that isn't in our church or that doesn't identify as a Christian, and help that person make some spiritual sense out of their lives or out of the things going on in the world. So just that kind of simple shift in getting people to think differently and work towards more faithful innovation as a way forward for the church, that perhaps our churches are a little stuck. And
I love
this
this.
stuff is for my church too. It's not.
I love this, like the idea of disciple making, not just as Bible study, but disciple making as a way to make disciples is to get people out and about. And it's a great way to make new disciples as well as you're out and about. I mean, imagine if Jesus was sitting around with his 12 disciples reading Torah all day, and that's all they did, right? That disciple making process might have been a bit more shallow than getting out on the adventure and seeing what the Spirit of God does on the adventure.
Yeah, good. That's good, Nick.
So much of what we've done in making new disciples, especially in terms of missiology, has been steeped in colonialism. I appreciate our Canadian siblings so much and the land acknowledgements that begin their meetings. The United States has a long way to go there. But I'm wondering your thoughts on how we do missiology and discipleship in a way that either isn't colonial or is potentially less colonial.
It is a great question. And the land acknowledgement that Jen did, that was actually, this group of people was instrumental actually for me. I live on Shumash land here in Southern California, and meeting all of my Canadian friends, some of whom that are on this Zoom call, actually has spurred me to learn about the indigenous folks that lived on the land that I currently am on. And I think about this now almost daily, and that's largely because of some of the people that I'm with today. But it's a good question, and the answers would be a lot longer than the time needed to deal with it. And I just touch on it in the book, and I touch on it because to some people, and especially to folks out in our neighborhoods, discipleship can be seen as a dirty word. I mean, it can be very problematic for a lot of different people. The abuse of power, the oppression, hierarchical relationships, I mean, things that have caused a lot of pain. And abuse, and Christians have done and justified a lot of things that are just absolutely heartbreaking, and require repentance, and probably many steps beyond just repentance. So to maybe get at the question a little bit, there's been this metaphor just recently. It's actually not something from my book, but it's from someone else. And his name is Doug Poe Jr. And he wrote a book called The Adept Church. And I heard him speak and was really impressed with this metaphor. I found it really helpful. And it actually comes from an original metaphor from Howard Thurman, the theologian. Yeah. And this author took it, and he basically, Howard Thurman was saying that, well, there's three kinds of Christians. And this guy took his individualistic metaphor and turned it into a metaphor for the church today. And so he says, well, there's three kinds of churches. And they're all to do with water, right? Swamp, reservoir, and canal. And so when I heard him speak on this, I thought it was really pretty impressive. And he was basically saying that swamp churches, now we know today more than Howard Thurman knew in like the 60s about swamps. Swamps aren't all bad. And the truth is that we would find all three of these things probably within all of our churches. I know that when I do some introspective work, I find all three of these things within our church. But the swamp churches are like inwardly focused, and they're concerned with self-preservation. And so there's not a lot of life going on in the swamp, and these churches are largely in survival mode. They're not connecting well to their community. And then you kind of move to reservoir, which is like, when we think about reservoirs, like large stored up bodies of water that move in one direction. They move from the reservoir to the people who need that water. And so this is maybe your more typical, more colonial version of mission, right? Of ministry to, or ministry for other people. Mm-hmm. But what it lacks is the relationship and the ministry with. Mm-hmm. And so the fun part of this metaphor, which also is the one that gets the most difficult, is canal ministry, where a canal is connecting one body of water to another. Mm-hmm. And that is characterized by ministry with. And I think that's the big shift that we could start thinking about is how do we make our ministries more canal-like, where the canal, it links, not only does it link outside of itself, the reservoir does well at that. Mm-hmm. The reservoir church uses its gifts and resources, but they kind of go one directional. And so there's a lack of reciprocity, there's a lack of mutuality. But with the canal thinking, know that our churches have the opportunity to grow through these relational connections and integrating within our local community and allowing our neighborhood and folks outside of our church to also influence us. So I wouldn't want to say, here's how you should do it in your context, but I think that frame is really helpful for me. And I've been using it lately with groups to try to do better ministry with. And it's tough work, but it's fun work too. So I would say, think on that and take a group of people and, really push the stuff that our churches are doing through that kind of lens and see what happens.
Now, in so many ways, it's just so much easier to do reservoir ministry, right? You're kind of the hero.
Way easier.
You're the hero. You get to go in, you get to do whatever you're doing to somebody. Hopefully it's helpful in some way, but there's no mutuality. And that mutuality is what takes work and time and effort and energy and relationship, right? So thank you for that encouragement. I think it does help us get beyond some of the colonial tendencies that churches have been practicing for a long time.
It's also, I would say also, Nick, it's more fun. Yeah, the mutuality of relationships and developing friendships, and not treating people as objects to be discipled, but developing actual friendship is fun. Like, mm-hmm. This is the work, and the work that we're called to is actually fun. So I just think there's also that natural component of, we're not called to drudgery, like, people are great. As we develop friendships through the things we're doing, this is great. It enriches our lives. It's transformative for for us as well, hopefully for them, and hopefully that's mutual,
Thank you for that note. And then just a good encouragement, as we are creating experiments, as we are creating environments where experimentation is prioritized. I do think before we get into a bit of the nuts and bolts in this, I'd love for you to name what you imagine is different in the work of a person who identifies as Christian in their work of innovation. What is a big question that we've been asking with all cyclical ecosystems is what exactly is faithful innovation? And how might that differ from just innovation?
Yeah, great. That is a great question. So I hear you talk about this, Nick, all the time, and I have seen it in other books and thinking on innovation about the different types of innovation, right? And so I think maybe it was Scott Cormode's Innovative Church that kind of said that we've got 5 types of innovation: product innovation, pretty simple, like your iPhone or whatever; internet innovation; process innovation; social innovation. But faithful innovation is a shift in thinking, because of adding the word faithful.
Yeah, right. I mean, the
We're
last thing we want this to become is like there's music and there's Christian music. I don't want it to be just like some sort of like empty adjective, right? I hope it does have some meaning and some guts to
Right.
it.
Yeah, good. I think we can do a lot better than adding Christian to music. We can
Yeah,
do better than that.
I think so too.
So, I mean, that adding that 5th part of innovation, which is meaning making,
Yeah.
I think will kind of shift the thinking from just innovation for innovation's sake, which really, I mean, innovators like to innovate, but that's not why you and I are sitting here with this group of people talking about innovation in the church,
Right.
just so that we can say how cool we are and how innovative we are and whatever. It's actually innovation for the purpose of meaning making. And so, that's some Scott Cormode stuff in his Innovative Church, that, that faithful innovation is taking that meaning making seriously, helping people to make spiritual sense of their lives and of the world around them. And I think that's important because a lot of times, especially in our kind of polarizing, weird political climate that we're in today, a lot of churches are afraid to talk about what's happening in the world.
Mhm.
And I just have the opposite. Personally, I have the opposite approach. I think if we're not talking and helping people make sense of what's happening in the world through the lens of our faith in Jesus Christ, that we're missing out on one of our biggest and best opportunities to be discipling other people. So I know that we've been talking about, this definition of, I don't know if we've landed on one yet, but that idea of creating tomorrow today through meaning making
That's good.
is one that, yeah, you and I've kind of kicked that around a little bit, by helping people make spiritual sense of their lives and the world, right? I mean, that's kind of where we are today with that
Would
anyway.
you say that's a good baseline for how to view disciple making?
I think it's an excellent way. Yes. Is it the thing? I don't know. But it is certainly very, very helpful frame for disciple making. Absolutely. I personally love it.
Yeah. Do you have like a narrative you can think of how Christians have practiced faithful innovation that's led toward disciple making?
I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. What are you asking? Say it again.
Like a practical narrative of how people have practiced faithful innovation for the purpose of making new disciples, making
Yeah.
meaning in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I haven't heard you talk about the mercy story before.
Yeah, I'll give a historical example just because I think it's one that was important to me, and it was important to, since we've got discerners and church starters here, this was a story that was really important to my the discernment team for planting that was with me. And I found this story from, I think he's a sociologist, right? Rodney Stark. And he told this story about what I would call innovation. And the reason I want to highlight this story is because people think certain things about innovation, and innovation really is just taking an idea and putting it into practice.
Yeah.
And so this is really good church innovation. And and it's a story about mercy, and it's took place during one of the great plagues, when people were just like, the description of this time period was frightening. People were dying so fast, and even people that were not dead yet were just being thrown out into the streets, and bodies were piling up, and it was just this horrible time. And Christians did something innovative. They decided that instead of fleeing the cities, Christians decided that they would stay and take care of the sick and the dying.
Yeah.
And like this story still gets me even when I tell it 8 years later, because it's important. Not only did they reduce the mortality rate by up to 1/3 by staying and taking care of sick people, but what happened was that their non-Christian neighbors saw what they were doing. And so Rodney Stark actually quotes what people were saying about these Christian people who were showing mercy and compassion and taking care of the dying. And he says that their non-Christian neighbors called them miracle workers. That gets me every time. And that is innovation right there, taking an idea and doing something that when other people are fleeing, Christians said, nope, we're not going to flee. We're going to take care of these people. And the church went into a serious and really significant period of growth because of that simple innovation.
So just to map what you're saying, that's a social innovation that bent toward meaning-making innovation and made meaning for people, which was a great example of faithful innovation that brought about new discipleship over the course of, sounds like I don't remember it lasting for a long time, but it makes sense that would kick off a whole movement of people now understanding Christians as miracle workers. That's pretty strong.
Yeah, well done. That's why you get paid the big bucks right there. You did what I don't know how to do.
We love your verboseness, Rob. It gets us every time. All right, so you have a new ministry you're launching that has been a result of this book called Cyclcial Full Circle. Can you share a little bit about Cyclcial Full Circle and what we've been learning there that might add to the conversation that our friends are about to have in their breakout groups?
Yeah, I mean, the things we've been learning are that this has been a really difficult time for churches. It's been a really difficult time for our church. I highlighted talking before we started that, I mean, we don't even have a place to gather still a year and a half later as a church. We're like the only church that's left still online because we're having so much trouble. I mean, this just continues to be difficult for all of our churches. And so one of the things we've noticed in some of the latest statistics, and I don't know how true they bear in Canada, our Canadian friends would have to help us with this, but some of the statistics currently that we're seeing are that 80 to 85% of our Protestant churches in the US are on the right side, the declining side of the bell curve on the life cycle of a church. So 85% of our churches are said to be either in maintenance, preservation, or what we might call like ICU, right? These are churches that are dying. And that's a lot of churches. And again, we thought we might be able to be helpful in this. And so the hard part, Nick, is there's a book by this, I can't remember the guy's name, Alan something or other, and he wrote a book on, I think it was called Change or Die. All right.
Yeah.
And so he does all this research on change. And I just remember I read one story, and he highlights 600,000 people that had heart surgery.
Okay.
And all of the 600,000 people, by far the vast majority of them, these people were supposed to be healthy coming out of these surgeries, right? Yeah. And so they surveyed these folks like a year later or 2 years later, and they asked them, what substantive changes have you made since your surgery when it comes to your exercise and your diet?
Okay.
This is just astounding. 90% of those surveyed had not made one single change to their exercise or their diet. And so what this author was writing about change, he was saying these people had everything that it took to live, and that they in fact would rather die than make any substantive change in their life.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what we're up against with the church. The church is a very stubborn and slow organization and very resistant to change.
Sure, yeah.
So in a lot of cases, we're seeing with the church that they would rather choose to die than make substantive change.
Yeah.
And so Cyclcial, at least, we want to say, we think we can do this. We think we can help guide some of those churches that are really struggling to walk with them through a process that helps them to choose to live.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're trying to do with some different assessment tools, and then some kind of guiding and walking alongside to try to help people think a little differently and choose to make some changes that lead to life.
So in case y'all haven't noticed, I think it's pretty clear to me that Rob has some passion and a lot of frameworks, a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience around helping churches to experiment. Why? Oh, how to say this, Rob? Let's just do a nice red ribbon here. Let's tighten this. So if you could share one thing that all leaders who want to practice faithful innovation might take from all that you've been learning around making new disciples, like what's the one thing that you would share with us?
Oh gosh. All right, it'll be one thing with two parts.
Yeah, you would.
Sorry. And it's something that I've been learning, and would never have said this if you had asked me this question 2 years ago, because it seems so counterintuitive. But everything I've been learning about innovative cultures and innovative organizations is that they do share something in common. And that is that innovation is best done in quantity, not quality. Mm-hmm. And that sounds extremely counterintuitive. And when I first heard it, I would strongly disagree. As a person who's kind of OCD and a bit of a perfectionist, that really bothers me. But now I understand it a little bit better. And I think we've got to get used to generating as many ideas as we possibly can, like talking about that divergent phase of a practical theology cycle, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then taking those as many ideas as our teams can come up with, and then working that convergent side of the practical theology cycle that narrows to a few experiments to try. So, and then the second part would just be, we know that when we come up with this many ideas, they're not all going to be good ideas, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, half of my ideas are just awful.
No, that was generous that you gave yourself half. I thought you were going to go higher than that.
Yeah, it probably is higher than that. Yeah, depending on who you ask, I guess, right? But a lot of those ideas and the experiments that we try they're not going to be good ones. They're going to be a lot of failure associated with this. But the thing is that's part two, is that innovative cultures and organizations understand that failure is one of our best teachers, that we can learn from it if we're willing to learn from it and then repeat the cycle again. So I think that's what I would say. If you're going to try one thing, just come up with as many ideas and launch as many experiments as we can, and see what works well in your context, and learn from our failures and our mistakes.
I mean, I just love this, Rob. I know this is what separates you. This is what separates your book on disciple making. That the process of disciple making is about experimenting. The process of experimenting will deepen people in their disciple making. And then the experiments themselves will engage with people who don't identify as Christian and make new disciples. So thank you for that. All this stuff, the Swamp Reservoir Canal, so good, right? So good. And how do we create experiments that are less colonial, hopefully not colonial, right? This work around faithful innovation. How do we create meaning making in the experiments that we're doing? Your change or die reference. That's a strong narrative, and just the reality that such a high ratio of our churches are moving toward the end of their life cycle unless they change, unless they experiment. And of course, yeah, like you said, experiment, and welcome failure. There's this piece that many of you have already heard, and that's to fail fast. But I think what we're learning now is not even to prioritize failing fast, but to push experiments all the way to the edges so that they do fail and then pick up from there and then go even further. We see this happening right now with the rocket ship that launched into space today, right? SpaceX just sent up 4 people that are going further away from the planet than anyone in a really long time, and they're going to orbit for 3 days. It started with a little rocket ship going off the ground 4 feet and exploding. They learned from that. Then they took it up 20 feet and it exploded. And then they took it up 20 feet and moved it to the left until it exploded. And they ran this through. And now we have 4 people orbiting the Earth right over our heads today to this day. So whatever we can do to join God in that sort of activity, I think we're going to be well suited. So I do want to leave. We have 9 minutes for Q&A. I hope that you all have some questions for Rob. Make sure and push the edges here for him. Press him here. Don't let him get away with what he's just saying. Give him a hard time. Give him some love, whatever you want to do. But yeah, are there any questions for Rob that you might want to ask from your particular context about experimentation, about creating environments for experimentation, about failure, about post-colonial disciple making, post-colonial missiology? So many things we could talk about with Rob while we have him here for the next 9 minutes.
That's good. They can push, and then I'll just take all the hard questions and funnel them back to you.
So Rob,
ask all the difficult questions.
Glenn Soderholm here from Guelph, Ontario. Thanks for your insights. I have a lot of introverts in my church. What do you do with that? And I don't even know if this is a bit of a cultural thing. Canadians sort of tend to be known as a bit more reticent in general, and not quite as enthusiastic as our brothers and sisters south of the 49th. So, yeah, how do you talk about this connecting to neighbors and, having that? I'm an extrovert, so I that's what I do, and I'm built for it. But I find my introverts resisting me. So, have you had that experience?
Glenn, thank you. That's a great question. And I'll start by saying that I am an introvert. And was terrified being called into ministry because I'm an introvert. And I was like, oh, this is not for introverts. Ministry is for extroverts. And I've learned that I was wrong, but it was a painful process for me. So yes, I hear this all the time. I've got introverts in my family and in our church, and I'm one myself. So to me, I would just say that recovering the more natural relational things, because introverts do not necessarily dislike people. Now, I do have some introvert friends that do. They would say like, well, I really don't like people. But that's not the case for a lot of introverts. Like, I'm an introvert and I love people. I just get worn down by people and I have to have time to be by myself. And so, I always just encourage introverts to be themselves. Introverts need friends too. Introverts meet people. They spend time getting to know their neighbors and have a lot of introverts have really deep friendships, maybe not as many friendships, but deep friendships. So I would say when it comes to the subject matter we're talking today, that we're looking for spiritually curious people. Like, I've got friends as an introvert that they want to, or they show an interest in something I do, or they want to make spiritual sense out of something that they're having a hard time with. And they may ask me a question. And so those are the folks that I'm particularly paying attention to. Someone that showed some curiosity or asked a question or wants to know more. Introverts can do that type of thing. I think it's scary for introverts to when you get programmatic, like very evangelistic style of programs, you're not going to get any introverts to sign up to do that kind of stuff. So you're creating experiments that work for your people in your context, and you would take that into consideration. I would take that into consideration in my context, because I've got a bunch of introverts as well. So I mean, those are just a few things that kind of jump off the top of my head. I hope that's answers your question a little bit.
I think Richard has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Rob, it's great to see you again. I think we met.
Yeah, we did. You too.
Plus, so it was really awesome. Thank you for joining us. I have a maybe a hard question. It's related to that. You're talking about innovation and faithful innovation, so that bringing that faith into it. So I'm a huge fan of getting out into the neighborhood and building relationships and so on. So I came upon something which I thought was really hard personally. I'll just say there's conflict between two individuals in a role that I'm playing in my apartment. It's called a strata, but it's like, so people were like, well, Richard, what should we do? And I had already gone and talked to each of them and proposed something, and they know I'm a pastor. I don't hide my Christianity, but I don't really force it upon anyone. It's just there, and if people want to ask, it's there. So in this particular instance, I made a suggestion, and it was basically let's try and be a good neighbor to each other, and let's agree on that. And so I got the answer back, no, I don't want to talk to them. So, so anyway, it became in that light, I'm sitting there talking to maybe the leadership group about this. And they're like, Richard, what should we do? And I'm thinking, man, let's pray together. I'm at, it's a condo meeting, and I'm like, let's look to God. And I did not say that. And I was, I guess I was at a loss as to a step to constructively move forward and try and do something where I was both, faithful and innovative. That I think that, so can you work with me on that one at all, or is it, because I think that's representative of what we're dealing with. So.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I'm curious, and first of all, it's good to see you. I remember walking with you and having some really good chats a few years ago. So really nice to see you. And thanks for throwing out an impossible question that I don't know how to answer. I'm curious, I would ask a question back. So what I would do as a coach, if I were coaching right now, is ask you, did you throw that scenario out to, who did you put that scenario out to? What group of people heard you talk about that?
So the individuals involved in the conflict, I threw it out to them personally, and to the leadership group that was, it's the Strata Council is what it is, but yeah. And
so when you threw that question out there to your leadership group, what ideas were generated?
Yeah, they thought it was all a good idea, and they were like, yeah, let's do that. And so we did propose it, but then we got back, the response, and then everyone was, well, like, okay, what do we do next? And in the end, the way I answered it was, yeah, I'm open to ideas, and everyone, it was a good conversation. It wasn't, colonial or, but it was, no one had any answers. And so we just, in the end, we said, well, okay, these are the options. And they were kind of like the standard options without innovation, right?
Right. So I'll I'm going to resist answering the question and telling you what to do, but here's what I would do if I was in your scenario. I would go back to that leadership group and I would run that practical theology, or you can call it an innovation cycle, with that group of people. And what you want to do is you want to generate, first of all, you want to listen listen to everyone talk. You're a Christian. You're trying to discern God and join the mission of God, but have that group generate as many ideas as they can. Then look at what one or two of those ideas rise to the top and try one. And if that doesn't work, then take the second idea and try it. That's how I mean, that's in the context of what we're doing today. That's probably what I would try, is have that group generate the ideas, and not all of them are going to work, but I would try one or two of them and then keep going back at it. That's the process, without me telling you what to do or answering your question, because that is a difficult one.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah. So, okay, that's good. And maybe I can just answer as I'm thinking, maybe not being afraid to fail is a good thing. Like, let's throw a few of these things out, and maybe by the fifth one, we'll get something that works or sticks, right?
Perfect. I think you're right on. Yep. Thank you. It's a good question.
This has been really great to have you, Rob, and Nick as well, to kind of host an interview, and to hear all about this, about your book, and just a bunch of the thoughts today has been really great. We are a minute